Think of the most confidently wrong person you've ever met. Maybe it was someone at work, absolutely certain their half formed idea was genius. Maybe it was someone at a dinner table, holding court on a subject they clearly knew nothing about. Maybe it was someone online, arguing with experts with the calm certainty of someone who had just spent 20 minutes reading about a topic for the very first time. You've met this person. You might have wanted to say something. You probably didn't. But here's the strange part, that person wasn't pretending. They weren't performing confidence they didn't feel. They genuinely believed they knew what they were talking about. And the reason they believed it reveals one of the most unsettling truths about the human mind. The less you know about something, the harder it is to know how much you don't know. This is the Dunning-Kruger Effect. And once you understand it, you'll never look at confidence or your own the same way again. In 1999, two psychologists at Cornell University, David Dunning and Justin Kruger, published a paper that would eventually become one of the most cited studies in modern psychology. It began with a question that sounds almost too simple. Why do incompetent people so consistently overestimate their own abilities? To find out, Dunning and Kruger ran a series of experiments. They tested undergraduate students on logical reasoning, grammar, and the ability to recognize what was funny. After each test, they asked participants to estimate how well they had performed, both in absolute terms and relative to everyone else. The results were striking. Students who performed in the bottom quarter consistently believed they had performed above average, not just slightly above average, far above average. On some tests, students who scored in the 12th percentile estimated themselves to be in the 62nd percentile. They weren't lying. They weren't being falsely modest in reverse. They genuinely had no idea how poorly they had done. And the reason, Dunning and Kruger argued, was this. The skills required to perform well at a task are often the same skills required to evaluate your own performance at that task. If you don't know enough about grammar to write well, you also don't know enough about grammar to recognize that your writing is poor. If you lack the logical reasoning to solve a problem correctly, you also lack the logical reasoning to identify where your solution went wrong. Incompetence, in other words, doesn't just produce errors, it hides them. But the study found something equally surprising at the other end of the scale. The students who performed best, those in the top quartile, consistently underestimated their own performance. People who were genuinely skilled at something tended to assume the task was similarly easy for everyone else. They assumed their competence was normal. This creates a peculiar inversion. The least capable people in a room are often the most confident. The most capable people in a room often doubt themselves the most. You may have experienced this directly. The first time you tried to learn something new, a language, an instrument, a technical skill, you probably felt relatively confident early on. You had learned the basics. You could hold a simple conversation, play a simple tune, write a simple line of code. What you didn't yet know was how much you didn't know. Then, as you learned more, something uncomfortable happened. You started to see the gaps. You started to understand the complexity you hadn't previously been able to perceive. Your confidence dropped. Not because you were getting worse, but because you were getting better. You were becoming competent enough to recognize your own incompetence. This is the valley that sits between beginner confidence and genuine expertise. And it is where most people quietly give up. The Dunning-Kruger curve, as it became known, has a distinctive shape. Confidence starts high at the very beginning, the peak that researchers sometimes call the summit of stupidity, or more formally, the peak of Mount Stupid. Then it plunges as knowledge grows and the true complexity of the subject becomes visible. It bottoms out in what's been called the Valley of Despair. And then, slowly, with continued learning and genuine expertise, it climbs again, but never quite back to the original height. Genuine experts are confident, but rarely as blindly confident as they were when they knew almost nothing. The most dangerous point on that curve is the very beginning. And in everyday life, that beginning is everywhere. Think about what the Dunning-Kruger effect means for the world you move through every day. It means that in most arguments, the people speaking with the greatest certainty are often the least informed. It means that in most organizations, the people most eager to lead are not always the most capable of leading well. It means that a person who has spent 2 weeks reading about a subject online may feel more confident in their opinions than a person who has spent 20 years studying it professionally. Because the professional knows how much remains unknown, and the newcomer doesn't. It also means something more personal. If you are in a field you know deeply, and you feel uncertain and full of doubt, that uncertainty is not a sign of weakness. It is a sign of competence. It means you have learned enough to see the true shape of the problem. The person across the table who has no doubts and speaks without hesitation may simply not have learned enough yet to know what they're missing. It's worth being honest about what the Dunning-Kruger effect is not. It is not a simple rule that says stupid people are always overconfident and smart people always doubt themselves. It is not a fixed personality trait, and it does not apply uniformly across all areas of any single person's life. Everyone is an expert in some things and a beginner in others, which means everyone is subject to Dunning-Kruger in the areas where they are least experienced, regardless of how intelligent or self-aware they are in other areas, including you, including the person writing this, including the researchers who discovered it. Dunning himself has noted that the effect applies to his own thinking in domains where he lacks expertise. Self-awareness does not grant immunity. It only makes you slightly more likely to pause and ask whether you might be wrong. So, the next time you find yourself completely certain about something you recently learned, that certainty itself is worth examining. Not because confidence is bad, not because doubt is always wise, but because the feeling of knowing is not the same as actually knowing. And the gap between those two things is where some of the most consequential mistakes in human history have been made. By individuals, by institutions, and by societies that were absolutely sure they understood something they had barely begun to grasp. The most dangerous words in any language are probably these: I already know enough about this. The uncomfortable truth is that the more you learn about almost anything, the more you realize how much further there is to go. Genuine expertise doesn't feel like certainty. It feels like a constantly expanding awareness of everything you still don't understand. And now that you know that, you might find yourself looking a little differently at the people in your life who seem to have no doubts at all.